Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who seemed to think they were the supreme ruler of a tiny kingdom? A little Napoleon in a sensible cardigan, perhaps? Well, I have, and let me tell you, this one, Carol Jenkins, took it to a whole new level. She actually had my power turn off, if you could believe that. But what happened next? Well, let's just say the sparks really flew, and not in the way she intended. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know if you've had similar experiences with power-tripping HOAs, because honestly, some of these stories need to be shared. My name is Sarah Mays, and a little over a year ago, I was looking for quiet. My husband, Mark, had passed away 6 months prior after a hard-fought battle that followed a long, distinguished military career. We'd served together, different branches, different specialties, but always a team. His loss left a silence in my life, so profound it felt like a physical presence. I bought a small house in a subdivision called Serene Meadows, a name that, at the time, seemed to promise the tranquility I craved. Mark had always dreamed of a small, peaceful garden, a place with a bench where he could read, maybe a few specific plants that reminded him of places we'd been stationed. I wanted to build that garden for him, a living memorial. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was a retired military signals intelligence analyst. My days of deciphering conflict were supposed to be behind me. I just want to plant some roses and forget-me-nots. Serene Meadows, however, came with an encumbrance, a homeowners association, and its president, Carol Jenkins. My first encounter with Carol was less than a week after I moved in. I was out front, measuring a patch of lawn where I envisioned Mark's garden, when a shadow fell over my notepad. Carol Jenkins was a woman who seemed permanently corseted by her own sense of importance. Her lips pursed as if constantly tasting something unpleasant, probably joy. She held a clipboard like a scepter. "Good morning," I said, offering a small, hopeful smile. "Sarah Mays. I just moved in a number 12-inch. Carol Jenkins, HOA president," she announced, her voice as crisp as an overstarched shirt. "I trust you've received and reviewed the covenants, conditions, and restrictions." "I have the binder, yes," I confirmed, still working my way through it. "It's quite comprehensive." "It is," she said, with an air of someone who had personally chiseled each rule into stone tablets. In Section 4, Subsection B, Paragraph 3 clearly states all landscaping modifications require prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. She tapped the clipboard. "Which, by the way, I chair." "Of course you do," I thought. I said. "I was just planning a small memorial garden for my late husband. Very tasteful, some flowers, a bench." Carol's eyes, small and suspicious, narrowed. "Memorial garden sounds potentially non-compliant. We have standards for aesthetic uniformity in Serene Meadows, Mr. Mays, is it?" "It's Sarah," I corrected, my smile feeling a little strained. "And Mark, my husband, always wanted something like this. It'll be very discreet." "Discretion is subjective," she sniffed. "Submit a detailed plan. Plant types, dimensions, materials for the bench, color palette. We'll review it at the next quarterly meeting." "Quarterly? That'll be months." "I was hoping to start sooner," I said politely. "It's a difficult time, and this project means a lot to me." "Grief is not an exemption from the rules, Mrs. Mays," Carol stated, her tone final. She made a note on her clipboard, a decisive, scratching sound that set my teeth on edge. "Adherence to the rules is what keeps Serene Meadows serene." With that, she pivoted and marched off, leaving me standing there with my measuring tape and a sinking feeling. This was not going to be easy. I did submit a plan, detailed, and I thought undeniably tasteful. It was rejected. The reason given was vague. "Does not conform to the established visual harmony of the community." I tried to appeal, to discuss it. I attended an HOA meeting, a depressing affair held in a stuffy community room, where Carol presided like a minor deity, flanked by a few nodding sycophants on the board. My request to speak was not on the agenda. It became clear Carol simply didn't like me or my idea, and that was that. But the garden was for Mark. It wasn't just about flowers. It was a promise. So I started, quietly. I chose a small, partially hidden area in my backyard, screened by existing shrubs. I used muted colors, native plants. I even found the exact type of climbing Rosemark had admired on our last anniversary trip. I bought a simple, unassuming stone bench, and I had a few small, solar-powered garden lights, ones Mark himself had bought years ago, little beacons he'd loved. They cast a gentle glow, nothing offensive. The finds started arriving a week later. Unapproved landscaping alterations, non-compliant flora, then the threats escalated. One sweltering August afternoon, I was trying to rig up a temporary shade cloth for some struggling new perennials when my air conditioning unit sputtered and died. The lights went out. The refrigerator hummed into silence. I checked the breaker box. Nothing tripped. Confused, I went outside. Two men I vaguely recognized as part of Carol's preferred landscaping crew were walking away from my utility meter, and Carol Jenkins herself was standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, a smirk playing on her lips. "Problem, Mrs. Mays?" she called out, her voice dripping with false concern. "My power is out, Carol," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Did you see what happened?" "Oh dear," she said, though her eyes danced with triumph. "There was a report of an unauthorized electrical modification on your property. Something about those little lights you insisted on installing. A potential fire hazard, you understand. The HOA has a duty to ensure the safety of all residents. We had to take emergency action and disconnect your service pending a full safety inspection." She tapped her ever-present clipboard. "I'll be conducting it myself, of course. Once you've rectified the, landscaping issues." The audacity of it stunned me. My small, harmless solar lights, a fire hazard. This wasn't about safety. This was a punitive, malicious act designed to strong-arm me into submission, to make me rip out Mark's garden. The temperature inside my house was already climbing. My food would spoil. More than that, the sheer, unadulterated abuse of power, the smug satisfaction on her face, it ignited something in me. A cold, clear anger. I stood there in the oppressive heat, watching her walk away, and I felt a shift. The grief was still there, a heavy cloak, but a new feeling began to stir beneath it. Resolve. This woman, this petty tyrant, had mistaken my quiet sorrow for weakness. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She'd cut my power, intending to break me. Instead, she just flipped a switch I hadn't realized was still active. "All right, Carol," I thought, the old analytical part of my brain clicking into gear. "You want to play games with rules and regulations? I know a few things about systems, and I know a few things about how people who abuse them operate." The sun beat down, but a different kind of heat was rising within me. Mark had always said, "Bureaucrats always leave a trail, Sarah. Paper or digital, it's always there. You just have to know where to look." He'd also said, "Never let a bully win. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. This was about justice." Carol Jenkins had started a war she was not prepared to fight. My initial shock gave way to a chilling clarity. The discomfort of the heat, the impending loss of refrigerated food, the sheer gall of Carol's actions, it all coalesced into a singular point of focus. She had made this personal, attacking not just my comfort, but the very sanctuary I was trying to build in Mark's memory. That was her first mistake. My training, dormant for years, began to surface. Observation, information gathering, pattern analysis, understanding networks, both technical and human. These weren't just skills, they were ingrained instincts. The first thing I did, even before the sweat had a chance to dry on my brow, was document. I took photos of the tampered meter, the two men walking away, Carol's smug expression from a distance my phone camera could just about capture. I noted the exact time. I even took a short video, narrating what had just happened, my voice tight but controlled. Evidence. Always start with evidence. Then, I pulled out the massive HOA binder Carol had been so proud of. For the next few hours, by the fading daylight, and then by flashlight, I read. Not just the section she quoted, but every single bylaw, every procedural codicil, every footnote. I cross-referenced with state statutes regarding HOA powers, utility company regulations. It was dry, tedious work, the kind of meticulous sifting that used to be my bread and butter when tracking illicit financial flows or communications networks. By the time I was done, I had a headache and a growing certainty. Carol had overstepped massively. An HOA, in most jurisdictions, simply couldn't unilaterally cut power like that, certainly not without due process involving the utility company in demonstrable, immediate danger, which a few solar garden spikes were clearly not. My mind began to catalog her vulnerabilities. Her arrogance was one. Her reliance on a small circle of enablers was another. And her belief in her own untouchability. People like Carol often get sloppy. They assume no one will ever dare to look too closely. That was her second mistake. As I sat there in the sweltering dark, a plan began to form, vague at first, then sharpening. I couldn't fight her on her terms, in her kangaroo court HOA meetings. I had to change the battlefield. I needed information, allies, and a strategy that would use her own tactics, her obsession with rules and appearances, against her. I started making a list. First, a thorough, quiet investigation into Carol Jenkins herself, or her own potential violations. What about the HOA's finances, the contracts she controlled? People who crave power like that often have a reason, and it's rarely altruistic. The next morning, still without power but fueled by coffee I'd made on a camping stove I thankfully still had from my field days, I started my reconnaissance. Not just digital, but physical. From the edge of my property, using a pair of old birdwatching binoculars Mark had favored, I began to observe Carol's house. It was, predictably, immaculate from the street. But even from a distance, I noticed a few things. An elaborate new deck that looked suspiciously recent. Extensive landscape lighting, far more complex than my little solar spikes. A brand new, top-of-the-line hot tub tucked away in her backyard, barely visible. Interesting, I thought. I wonder if those all had prior ARC approval? It felt like a monumental task, going up against someone so entrenched. Have you ever felt like David against Goliath in your own life? Let me know in the comments. This was my Goliath, and I was just starting to look for stones. My quiet quest for allies began subtly. I needed people who had also felt the sting of Carol's arbitrary rule, people who might have information or simply the courage to stand up when the time came. My first overture was to Arthur Weathers, an elderly gentleman who lived across the street and a few houses down. He was often on his porch, a retired electrician by trade, and I'd seen him watching the goings-on in the neighborhood with a keen, thoughtful eye. I approached him the next day, bringing a thermos of lemonade, made with bottled water, of course, since my fridge was still a casualty. "Mr. Weathers," I began, "I'm Sarah Mays for number 12. I wonder if I might have a word." Arthur had kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Please, call me Arthur, young lady. And I know who you are. Saw that business with your power yesterday. Damn shame. Relief washed over me. An eyewitness. You saw it. Saw those two HOA yes-men fiddling with your meter box. And then Carol Jenkins preening like a cat that got the cream," he confirmed, his voice rumbling with disapproval. "She's a piece of work, that one. Been running this HOA like her personal fiefdom for years. Gave me no end of grief about my bird feeders. Said they attracted undesirable elements, pigeons. Mostly," he chuckled, a dry, wheezing sound. "As a retired electrician, I can tell you what they did was likely not up to code, nor standard procedure for the power company." That was music to my ears. "Arthur," I said, "I intend to fight this. Not just for my power, but because what she's doing is wrong. Would you be willing to share what you saw, officially, if it came to it?" His gaze sharpened. "Carol Jenkins has bullied this neighborhood for too long. If you got a plan to set things right, Sarah, I'm with you. And I might know a thing or two about electrical systems that could prove useful." My next ally came in the form of Maria Rodriguez, a mother of 3 young children who lived on the next cul-de-sac. I'd heard snippets of her struggles with Carol over the excessive noise of her children playing in their own fenced backyard. Maria was young, energetic, and palpably frustrated. I found her at the community playground, pushing her youngest on a swing. "Maria," I said, after introducing myself, "I'm having some issues with Carol Jenkins. I heard you might have had some, too." Her face tightened. "Issues? That woman is a nightmare. She sent me a violation notice because my son's tricycle was visible from the street for 2 hours. said it detracted from the manicured appearance of the neighborhood. She shook her head. I'd love to see her taken down a peg, but she's got the board wrapped around her little finger. I think there might be a way, I said, but I need help. You know people in the neighborhood, especially the younger families. And I suspect you're pretty good with online stuff? Maria grinned. I can find out what someone had for breakfast 5 years ago if it's been posted online. What do you have in mind? The final piece of my initial alliance puzzle clicked into place when Arthur mentioned Mr. Henderson, a retired accountant who had served on the HOA board for a single, tumultuous term before resigning in disgust. Said he couldn't stomach Carol's creative bookkeeping. Arthur told me. Mr. Henderson was cautious at first, a prim man who valued order and propriety. But when I explained my situation and my suspicions about Carol's broader misconduct, his professional indignation slowly overcame his reluctance. She always steered contracts to certain companies, he admitted, his brow furrowed. Landscaping, repairs, even legal services. Prices always seemed inflated. But challenging her was like wrestling a badger in a sack. With Arthur's technical knowledge, Maria's community outreach and digital research skills, and Mr. Henderson's financial acumen, my ad hoc investigative team was formed. We began to dig. Arthur confirmed that the manner of my power disconnection was highly irregular and likely violated utility company protocols, possibly even state law. Maria started a discreet online group for Serene Meadows residents, a safe space to share stories about Carol. The response was immediate and overwhelming, a flood of grievances, from petty fines to allegations of favoritism and intimidation. Several former residents, now free from Carol's reach, offered more damning accounts. Mr. Henderson, with careful guidance from me on where to look for public records, started scrutinizing HOA financial statements, tax filings, and meeting minutes going back years. He focused on no-bid contracts awarded to businesses that, with a little digging by Maria, turned out to be owned by Carol's brother-in-law and a close personal friend. The landscaping company that employed the men who cut my power, owned by Carol's cousin. The fees were indeed exorbitant. Meanwhile, I continued my own surveillance. My SIGINT training was all about finding patterns in noise, identifying anomalies. I cross-referenced Carol's official HOA communications with the timing of her contract awards and fine issuances. A clear pattern emerged. Dissent was met with punitive action, while compliance and silence was sometimes rewarded with a blind eye to minor infractions, if you were in her good graces. I also meticulously documented her own property. The new deck? No permit on file with the city. The elaborate electrical work for her lighting and new hot tub? Again, no permits. This was a woman who demanded absolute adherence to the rules from others while flagrantly violating them herself. Carol, of course, didn't remain idle. Feeling emboldened by her successful power play against me, she escalated. I received a flurry of new violation notices, failure to maintain property, hard to do without power for my tools, continued defiance of ARC directives, and even a ludicrous, improper storage of emergency supplies when she spotted my camping stove through a window. She clearly felt untouchable. At a sparsely attended HOA board meeting, which Maria's teenage son cleverly recorded on his phone from the back of the room, Carol was heard boasting, "Some residents need to learn that rules are not suggestions. We are making an example, and I assure you, compliance will be achieved." She also noticed my conversations with Arthur and Maria. Arthur received a notice about his structurally unsound porch railing. It was perfectly fine, and Maria was warned about unsupervised children creating a neighborhood disturbance when her kids were playing quietly in their own yard. These were clear acts of intimidation, meant to isolate me. But instead of fracturing our small group, it solidified our resolve. Carol was making more mistakes, creating more evidence against herself with every arrogant pronouncement and retaliatory action. She was so convinced of her own superiority, she couldn't see the net tightening around her. The time for quiet investigation was drawing to a close. It was time to formulate a concrete plan of attack. Our little team gathered in my still powerless, but increasingly strategic, living room, huddled around a camping lantern. The air was thick with purpose. "All right," I began, laying out my field notes, now a surprisingly thick dossier, on the coffee table. We have substantial evidence. Arthur, your testimony about the power cut, coupled with my documentation and research into utility regulations, clearly shows an illegal act. Arthur nodded, his expression grim. It was malicious, plain and simple, and dangerous. Maria, I continued, your outreach has been incredible. We have over a dozen signed affidavits from current and former residents detailing Carol's harassment, selective enforcement, and abuse of power. The recording from the last meeting is gold. Her boasting will play very badly. Maria's eyes shone with a fierce light. People are angry, Sarah. They're just scared to speak up alone. And, Mr. Henderson, I turned to the retired accountant. Your financial analysis is the linchpin. The patterns of cronyism, the inflated contracts, the potential misuse of HOA funds, it's damning. Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses, a hint of grim satisfaction on his face. The numbers don't lie, Mrs. Mays. There are serious questions that demand answers, questions that point to significant financial mismanagement at best. So, here's the strategy I outlined. 1. We use the HOA bylaws themselves to force a special meeting of all homeowners. Maria, you'll spearhead the petition drive for that. We need 25% of homeowners to sign. I think we can get that easily now. Done, Maria said confidently. 2. At that meeting, we present our case systematically. Mr. Henderson will present the financial irregularities. Arthur will testify about the power incident and other instances of Carol overriding safety and proper procedure. I will present the pattern of harassment, the evidence of her own bylaw violations, the unpermitted deck, the questionable electrical work on her own property, and the sworn statement from other residents. I paused. We lay it all out, fact by fact, with supporting documentation for everything. No emotion, just cold, hard truth. She'll try to shout us down, discredit us, Arthur warned. Let her, I said, a faint, cold smile touching my lips. Her bluster will only make her look guiltier in the face of calm, factual presentation. We'll also prepare a packet of this evidence for every homeowner present and a copy for the local newspaper and the city council member for our district. Transparency is our weapon. My own focus had been not just on Carol's procedural abuses, but also her physical ones. My distant surveillance of her property continued. Those flickering lights at her place, the overloaded external junction box near her new hot tub, they weren't just casual observations anymore. Arthur, after reviewing my discreetly taken telephoto pictures, had expressed serious concern. That wiring looks like amateur hour, Sarah, he'd said, shaking his head. And that gauge of wire for a hot tub of that size? It's asking for trouble. Definitely not to code. If she ever had a proper inspection, she'd be shut down. The irony was not lost on me. The woman who'd cut my power over non-existent electrical hazards was sitting on a potential tinderbox of her own making. Carol, meanwhile, was oblivious, cocooned in her arrogance. She was busy trying to push through a massive special assessment against me, purportedly to cover the costs of my non-compliance, including the illegal disconnection of my power and the inspections she had yet to perform. She even attempted to ram through amendments to the bylaws at a poorly publicized board meeting, trying to grant herself even more unilateral authority. Each move she made, however, was now being documented by our network. She was, in essence, digging her own grave with every swing of her dictatorial shovel. The stakes were rising. Carol, perhaps sensing a shift in the neighborhood air, began a smear campaign against me, whispering to her cronies that I was a disruptive influence, a troublemaker with no respect for community values. Vague legalistic letters, penned by an HOA lawyer who was likely another beneficiary of her network, started appearing in my mailbox, full of bluster and empty threats. The pressure was intense. There were moments of doubt, late at night, in the quiet, powerless house, when the weight of what we were attempting felt overwhelming. But then I'd think of Mark, of his quiet strength, his intolerance for bullies. I'd look at the plans for his garden, still just lines on paper, and my resolve would harden like tempered steel. My allies, too, felt the heat. Arthur found a citation on his car for parking too close to the curb, and Maria's kids were suddenly the subject of an anonymous complaint to Child Protective Services, quickly dismissed as baseless, but deeply upsetting. Carol was playing dirty, but it only made us more determined. This had to end. The day of the special HOA meeting arrived cloaked in a heavy, humid stillness that often precedes a summer storm. We had secured more than enough signatures for the petition, forcing Carol's hand. The community clubhouse, usually a place of bland notices and enforced quiet, buzzed with an unfamiliar energy. More residents than I'd ever seen at an HOA function filled the room, their faces a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and a simmering resentment I recognized all too well. Carol Jenkins sat at the head table, flanked by her usual board allies, her expression one of supreme confidence, tinged with annoyance at having her authority challenged. She clearly expected to quash this little rebellion with her usual blend of condescension and procedural bullying. The meeting began with Carol attempting to control the narrative, launching into a preemptive tirade about disgruntled elements and the importance of maintaining standards, but Maria, armed with Robert's Rules of Order and a newfound assertiveness, calmly but firmly invoked the purpose of the special meeting as per our petition. Reluctantly, Carol had to cede the floor. Mr. Henderson went first. He was the picture of an unassuming, retired accountant, but as he began to lay out the financial discrepancies, the no-bid contracts to Carol's relatives, the wildly inflated invoices for simple services, a hush fell over the room. He presented spreadsheets, copies of invoices and public records, his voice dry and precise, each fact a carefully placed stone in a growing wall of evidence against Carol. Whispers rippled through the audience. Next, Arthur Weathers stood up. His voice, though aged, was strong and clear as he recounted the events of my power disconnection. He explained, in layman's terms, but with an electrician's authority, how the act was not only irregular but dangerous and illegal. He then detailed other instances where Carol had overridden safety concerns or ignored professional advice when it suited her agenda. More murmurs, louder this time. Heads were turning towards Carol, whose confident smirk was beginning to falter, replaced by a tightening of her lips. It was my turn. I felt a strange calm settle over me. I walked to the podium, not with anger, but with the quiet determination of someone who knew they had the truth on their side. I laid out the pattern of harassment, not just against me, but against many others in the room, presenting copies of the violation notices, the fines, the threatening letters. I shared the affidavits Maria had collected, reading a few anonymous but powerful excerpts. Then I projected the photos, Carol's unpermitted deck, the non-compliant aesthetic of her own oversized yard ornaments she'd never find herself for, and finally, the close-ups of the suspect electrical wiring near her hot tub, the overloaded junction box. This, I said, my voice steady, is the home of the woman who cut my power, citing a non-existent fire hazard from small, solar-powered garden lights. This is the standard of safety and compliance our HOA president holds for herself. Carol leaped to her feet. This is an outrage. Lies. Slander. These are doctored photos. You have no proof. Her voice was shrill, cracking under the pressure. She looked around for support, but even her staunchest allies on the board were looking uncomfortable, avoiding her gaze. It was in that precise moment, as Carol's tirade reached its peak, that the doors to the clubhouse burst open. A young man, breathless, eyes wide with panic, yelled, "Fire! Carol Jenkins' house is on fire." There's smoke everywhere. The room erupted. Confusion, fear, and a stunned disbelief swept through the attendees. Carol froze mid-shriek, her face paling dramatically. "My house. Don't be ridiculous. It's probably just my barbecue." But the acrid smell of smoke, faint at first, was now undeniably wafting into the clubhouse. Someone shouted they were calling 911. The carefully constructed order of the meeting dissolved into chaos as people rushed to the windows, then outdoors. The HOA showdown was abruptly, shockingly, upstaged by a far more visceral drama. Carol, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror, shoved her way through the crowd, crying, "My things! My beautiful house!" The irony hung heavy in the air, thick as the smoke that was now visibly billowing from the direction of her property. The woman who wielded safety as a weapon was now facing a very real, very personal inferno. The turning point had arrived, not delivered by a vote, but by a blaze. The scene outside Carol Jenkins' house was one of controlled chaos. Sirens wailed as fire trucks converged on our normally quiet street. Flames were now clearly visible, leaping from the rear of her house, dangerously close to where I knew her new hot tub and that questionable electrical setup were located. Neighbors gathered at a safe distance, their faces illuminated by the flashing lights and the orange glow of the fire, a mixture of shock and morbid fascination in their eyes. Many of them had just been in the clubhouse, listening to the evidence against Carol. Now they were witnessing a far more dramatic, far more visceral form of reckoning. Carol herself was hysterical. She alternated between wringing her hands, trying to direct the firefighters, who professionally ignored her, and muttering about sabotage, her eyes darting wildly as if seeking someone to blame. Her carefully constructed facade of control had completely crumbled, revealing the panicked, self-absorbed person beneath. I stood with Arthur and Maria, watching the firefighters work with practiced efficiency. It was a terrible thing, a house fire, regardless of who owned it. Yet, a grim sense of poetic justice was impossible to ignore. The woman who had arbitrarily cut my power, alleging a phantom electrical hazard from my tiny solar garden lights, was now watching her own home consumed by what looked increasingly like a very real electrical fire. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than an hour, the fire chief, a sturdy man with soot smudged on his face, approached the perimeter where the homeowners were gathered. He cleared his throat, and a hush fell over the crowd. "We have the fire under control," he announced. "The cause appears to be electrical, originating from an overloaded, improperly wired junction box connected to an outdoor spa and extensive landscaping lights. It seems the installation was not permitted or up to code." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. All eyes turned, almost involuntarily, first to Carol, who looked like she'd been struck by lightning, and then to me. The chief's words, delivered with no knowledge of the HOA drama that had preceded the blaze, were a public, impartial confirmation of what I had alleged not an hour before. The evidence I'd presented about Carol's own violations was no longer just an accusation. It was now backed by the stark reality of smoldering ruins and the official assessment of the fire department. The immediate aftermath was swift. Carol, facing the loss of her home and the public revelation of her dangerous negligence, was a broken figure. Her insurance company, upon learning of the unpermitted, non-code compliant electrical work, would later drastically limit or deny her claim, a fact that would become common knowledge in the weeks to follow. Her reign of terror over Serene Meadows ended that day, not with a vote, but with the irrefutable evidence of her own hypocrisy laid bare for all to see. Back at the clubhouse, which people slowly drifted back to in a state of shock and adrenaline, an emergency motion was made by a visibly shaken board member, one who had previously been a Carol loyalist, to suspend Carol Jenkins from her duties as HOA president, pending a full investigation. It passed unanimously. Mr. Henderson was asked to step in as interim president, a role he accepted with solemn reluctance. My own vindication was almost immediate. Arthur, using his old contacts, called a utility company. He explained the situation, the illegal disconnection, the HOA president's now exposed malfeasance, and the fire chief's findings regarding Carol's own electrical hazards. Within hours, a utility truck was at my house. A very apologetic supervisor oversaw the reconnection of my power, assuring me there would be an internal investigation into how the initial disconnection was authorized based solely on an HOA request without proper verification. The hum of my refrigerator coming back to life was the sweetest sound I'd heard in days. The small solar lights in Mark's nascent garden, the supposed fire hazard, blinked on peacefully as dusk settled, tiny beacons of resilience. My initial goal, to simply live in peace and build Mark's garden, felt within reach once more, but the journey had irrevocably changed me in Serene Meadows. The weeks following the fire were transformative for Serene Meadows. Under Mr. Henderson's interim leadership, a new era of transparency began. The first order of business was a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances. As suspected, it uncovered years of mismanagement, cronyism in contract awards, and what amounted to embezzlement by Carol, funneling HOA funds into personal accounts disguised as reimbursements for non-existent expenses. Criminal charges were eventually filed against her. All the punitive fines Carol had levied against me and other residents were immediately rescinded. The Architectural Review Committee, she had ruled like a tyrant, was restructured with new, fair-minded members. The oppressive atmosphere of fear and petty regulation began to lift. Neighbors started talking to each other again, not in hushed whispers about Carol, but about how to make the community genuinely better. Maria Rodriguez, with her newfound confidence, was elected to the new HOA board and spearheaded efforts to revise the outdated and often ludicrous bylaws, ensuring they were fair, clearly written, and focused on actual community well-being rather than aesthetic totalitarianism. My life, too, found a new equilibrium. With my power restored and the threat of Carol gone, I finally completed Mark's Memorial Garden. It became a small sanctuary of peace, not just for me, but for others. Neighbors would sometimes stop by, sit on the stone bench, and enjoy the quiet beauty. Arthur Weathers became a regular visitor, sharing stories of his late wife, who had also loved gardening. The garden, born from grief and defiance, blossomed into a symbol of resilience and quiet community. I found I couldn't entirely return to the solitude I initially sought. The experience had reawakened skills I thought I'd left behind, and a sense of responsibility I hadn't expected. I reluctantly agreed to serve on a newly formed HOA oversight committee, lending my analytical abilities to ensure transparency and accountability remain paramount. It wasn't the peaceful retirement I'd envisioned, but it was purposeful. I had faced down a bully, not with aggression, but with diligence, observation, and the truth. I had, in my own way, honored Mark's spirit. As for Carol Jenkins, her downfall was absolute. Ostracized by the community, facing financial ruin from the uninsured portion of the fire damage and the impending legal battles over her fraudulent activities, she was forced to sell the charred remains of her house at a significant loss. She moved away in disgrace, a diminished figure stripped of her petty power and public standing. The last I heard, she was living in a small apartment complex across town, presumably having to abide by someone else's rules for a change. So, Carol's reign of terror ended not with a whimper, but with a blaze of her own making, a dramatic testament to the old adage that what goes around often comes around with a vengeance. The memorial garden for Mark finally flourished, a riot of color and fragrance, and Serene Meadows, under new leadership and a renewed sense of community, actually began to live up to its name. It just goes to show, sometimes the biggest bullies, blinded by their own arrogance, create the very conditions for their own spectacular downfall. Never underestimate the quiet ones, the ones who observe and gather facts while tyrants bluster. And never, ever, mess with a veteran's tribute to a fallen comrade, because you might just ignite a fire you cannot control. What's the biggest lesson you took from this story? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for listening.